here with Neil Longley, Facilities Management Consultant at Opale Management Services. Welcome, Neil.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Great, let's get started. I wanted to first ask you, tell me a little bit about yourself and your consulting firm and your role.
Okay, well, I'm a founder director of Opale Management Services. It's a limited company in the UK. About 29 years old now in terms of the business. It's a independent facilities advisory practice. Tend to be private sector. Clients like HSBC, Barclays, and so forth. And we provide them with advice on a whole raft of facilities management challenges, not least of which is the COVID-19 we all face at the moment. My role is, as I say, a director of that business. I should have mentioned that.
Okay, perfect. So speaking of COVID-19, we're headed into the last quarter of 2020, which has been a very crazy year for everyone. So what can you say so far, being in facilities management consulting, that you've seen are your learnings, your biggest learnings?
Well, I guess that sort of rests on a couple of three levels, really. I think for a lot of client organizations, the understanding of home working and working from home as a segment of space that they can deploy their resources into has become a real learning. I think historically they didn't, companies didn't feel that was a good way of working, that they wanted to impose cultural progress on their resources, their staff, and therefore had them in big offices. This has proven that actually you can perhaps do that and still have people working from home for a reasonable period of time. There is a distinction, however, in that between working from home and home working. Working from home is sort of opportunistic. It's the dining room table and the laptop, and we can do that for a reasonable period of time, 2 or 3 days perhaps, or a couple of weeks. But after that, it becomes very challenging for the individual to do that, whereas as home working is when a true office infrastructure exists at home that is for long-term working. So I think that's a big learning for companies, a big learning for facilities. Getting their heads around what the facilities, the business's responsibility will be to those home workers is quite a challenge at the moment. I think there's been a real understanding of the cost of everything. I think COVID's really crystallized that, some of the facilities that are provisioned for the employees are extremely expensive. And sometimes that's hidden when you're seeing it within the context of the income as well. But when the income starts going, as we've seen in a lot of businesses in the UK, the stark reality of what you've been spending on your office space becomes really quite clear. So from an FM perspective, there is a much clearer understanding, I think, and desire to understand how much all of this stuff is costing. And that's come to be a learning, I think. And finally, for me, on this particular question, there has been the learning of what you can do without. So from an FM perspective, and we are seeing a lot less, I'm going to be very cautious not to say a reduction in service level, but we are seeing service levels that are tuned differently to that they have been historically. So a much greater emphasis on techniques such as business focused maintenance or similar, in order to reduce the overall cost of the service without taking too much risk on infrastructural matters, dynamic cleaning processes. And we're also seeing a flattening, I think, of the FM structures as we look forward, and that's all driven because of cost. It just is a reality. We've got to provide these services, in our view, for 30% less cost than it was in January of this year, and that's a big, massive challenge.
Definitely. And I know you said you talked a little bit about home working.
Yep.
And I know a lot of businesses are at different phases right now, but let's talk a little bit about the return to work. What have you
Yeah.
seen from companies that are ready to bring employees back? What are they kind of talking about? How are they being forward thinking, not so much reactive, more thinking about in the future? What have you seen so far?
Well, of course, we have to group this depending upon what those resources are doing. So if you take manufacturing, a lot of the manufacturing space was not really impacted by social distancing because they were naturally more than 2 meters apart or a meter and a half or a meter apart as a normal part of their daily activities, and they're very cellular in most manufacturing organizations. So the challenges became getting people into the facility and out of the facility, not in operation within the facility itself. You have seen, I think, a lot of impacts with regard to welfare space segments such as restaurants and so forth, just not opening or being severely restricted, because that's obviously where the social distancing challenges within manufacturing really lie. They don't lie in the day-to-day, operations. They lie in where people go for their coffee, in a nutshell. But office space is very different, and we've seen several different reactions to it. The biggest implication at the moment for the office space that, as we understand it, biggest proportion of which in the UK is inside the M25, big city stuff, is the fact that we can't get the resources into the city in the first place. There isn't enough capacity in public transport to achieve that, as it was before. So we automatically have fewer people to accommodate because we can only get fewer people inside the city to go to work.
Right.
And anything over 5 floors is a real challenge to get them through the door and cleared, if you will, to go into the building. So what you end up with is a scenario where, if you take Canary Wharf, which is our sort of financial sector, to get people into some of those buildings, you're talking about 1.5 mile queue of people to get through the reception main, and up through into the building. So the buildings can't accommodate, under these social distancing rules, that level of occupancy. So what you end up with is 2 broadly different techniques, and that is that a sort of forced environment where those people that have to have an office to work from are given the space. Those that don't are sent home. And that stayed, I think, relatively obvious to all. And then you've got others that do, 50% on, 50% off techniques. So you can come in week 1 and then you go home, work for a week, and then you come back for a week and you go work for a week, all driven on the basis that they can accommodate maybe 40% of their original resources. Now that poses a big challenge from a cost perspective, because now we are running millions of square foot's worth of office space at the costs that they incur for now 50% of the resources that we used to provide those services for, and again that puts an even more cost pressure. I think there's one other observation I would make. I don't know that we particularly took a view on productivity when we were in normal working, if you will, pre-COVID. I don't think anyone really knew or there was a metrics that was measuring productivity of the individual in each of their given roles. And of course, when we go home working, therefore we don't have an equal measure to deploy on saying, is home working as productive or more productive or less productive than it was prior to COVID-19, and we don't have that data, so it's all anecdotal. And home working was deemed in the first 2 or 3 weeks to be the big thing. Everyone was really happy with the fact that I can work from home, and they got over those phobias of, oh, can I work in this closed environment, on my own, without my peers. We got over that for 3 weeks. Then if you look at the survey responses from that 3-week period onwards, over time, people have said, I really can't do this anymore. I'm now wanting to get back to where I was in the centre of London, Manchester, or wherever it may be, and sit with my colleagues and work as a team again. And then you've got another group that say, oh, it's still the best thing since sliced bread, providing, of course, I can work from home on a Friday and a Monday.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which has got nothing to do with productivity, incidentally.
Right. Exactly. Going back to what I said about sort of being forward thinking, what are you seeing in terms of technologies? Are you seeing any kind of technologies that are sort of being put into the spotlight now that we are trying to get people back into the office, or some businesses are?
Well, we had a challenge in FM terms, because the technology platform, innovation in FM, certainly in the UK, certainly in my view across Europe and broader, has always been a bit stagnant, a bit traditional. Out of the box thinking has not really been, well, FM has not had the reputation for being innovative, let us put it that way.
Okay.
Now, today, COVID-19 creates a catalyst to do something different. So COVID-19 is creating the catalyst to investigate and to be innovative around home working and working from home. That's a spotlight now, and therefore there is effort from the marketplace to say, how can we make that work? And the technologies to do that will subsequently appear. They're not there today, but they will appear at some point. There won't be new technologies, incidentally. There'll be an adaptation of something that's already been out there for many years, but it will be used to advance home working in our world. Within the office space, I think in recent years, there's been a move to creating what we call business intelligence, insight. And that is data hungry. So we've been using devices to capture data. How many times does the toilet door open, to give you an indication as to how many people have been through, so that you can maybe re-engineer your resources to match peak times and so on, to make it cleaner and nicer for the staff. So technology has been steadily providing us with data. I think what we will have is an increase in that, because we now want that data in order to re-engineer our organizational design, our target operating models, to be much more efficient. So we need the information. With the information, we can optimize how we do what we do. That ultimately means that we can do what we do at the right level, but at a lower cost.
Right.
So I see that, continuing, rightly so. Management information is king. And it's business intelligence that matters. And you can't be intelligent in running FM if you don't have management information. That's sort of where it sits.
That's a good segue into my final question, which is thinking about future facility managers or facility management consultants. What do you think the criteria is for experts or leaders in this space going forward?
What do we think? A loaded question. What do we think is going to happen to the FM marketplace looking forward? In the UK, and I'm talking UK, I guess, a little bit too much, but COVID-19 has identified that we have to do FM at less cost by 30% in our view, and with less resources. That's worldwide. But in the UK, we've got Brexit as well. So we now have the challenge of what was an economically challenging time on top of a real economically challenging time called COVID. Lifting above it all, we have to deliver FM in broad terms with less money and less resources. That's it. And if we keep it at that level and we look at the consequences of that position, it means that within the FM supply chain, we will be spending less money. So therefore, there has to be different techniques or methods of doing FM that marketplace has to provide. Because our marketplace is diverse in terms of white collar, blue collar type resources, the blue collar resources may be impacted by our Brexit challenge. So they may all go home, the ones that we actually, are actually employed in a lot of the blue collar activities underpinning our economy. Unfortunately, that means that there will potentially be a dearth of resources at that level. So again, we're going to have to do FM with less resources than we might have otherwise been able to. And therefore, you've got a reduction in structures. So you've got to have techniques where we can increase the productivity of the individual, that we can focus those individuals at just the activities we need them to do. So we will move, I think, more to a dynamic type of FM position. Where there's a hole, go fix it. Where there isn't a hole, don't go do it. That sort of environment. And I think the management structures will collapse. They will get much more compact in FM, which means that the individual resources have to become much more competent over a wider range of services that they will ultimately be managing. So we won't necessarily have structures that have a building maintenance capability, a catering capability and a cleaning capability all built into the structure. We might just have one person that has to have enough knowledge and understanding of all three of those subjects, as an example, as it collapses into a much more economically viable state. For the suppliers, of course, that means that they are looking down a reduction in their turnover. And that's got its own consequences commercially. But yeah.
Easy enough. No challenges ahead, right?
I think there's a lot of challenge that people are beginning to get their heads around. It's a challenge. I mean, we've called it the COVID oscillation, that people, there was a progression, wasn't there? Stop, because guess what? We haven't got any money to spend. So prior to that, it was react to the next rule, the next change, the whatever. We're going to work from home. You can't get into the office. They were all reaction within a week. Every day there was something massive happening. And I think FM managers were on a roller coaster, just putting black masking tape over all the holes as they appeared. Then we went to stop phase, and stop phase was don't spend anything because we've got no money. We've got to hold what money we've got to do what we need to do looking forward when we come out. And then we hit the recovery phase. But of course, we're now oscillating between recovery, stop, recovery, stop. We call it the COVID oscillation. And therefore within that, people aren't sure what to do next. They just sort of sat there going, rabbit in headlights. But ultimately, the reality is they have to plan. So what we're saying now is you plan to spend 30% less, put all of the structures in to do that, take every penny you can take out of the costs. You can always put it back in, but you need to get it out, and you need to get it out quickly. And that's sort of what our message is. Cost is king, cash is king. Businesses need cash in the bank. They haven't got much and they're burning it at a rate that they don't want to. Stop burning it. That's sort of the message.
Yep. Well, it'll definitely be interesting to see how the space changes over the next few months and years even. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, Neil. I think that sums up the questions that I had for you, and hopefully we can continue the conversation when things are a little bit less chaotic in the future, I hope.
I look forward to it. I really do look forward to it.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.